You're 8 years old, and the last thing you remember is your mother's scream echoing through stone corridors as rough hands drag you from your bed. The silk sheets that once promised warmth now tangle around your legs like chains as you struggle against men whose faces you can't see in the pre-dawn darkness. Your small fists beat uselessly against leather and mail, your noble blood meaning nothing to these soldiers who smell of sweat and fear and something else you're too young to identify. Death. The journey happens in fragments. A jolting carriage ride where your questions go unanswered. The taste of your own tears mixing with blood from where you bit your tongue. The gradual realization that the guards who once bowed when you passed now avoid your eyes entirely. You keep asking for your mother, your father, your younger sister, but the only response is silence thick enough to choke on. Then you see it. The tower. Not the fairy tale kind where princesses await rescue, but a thing of nightmares thrust up from barren ground like an accusatory finger pointing at an uncaring sky. No windows below the third story. Walls of stone so thick that even summer sun can't penetrate their cold. A single heavy door that groans like a dying man when they force it open. They push you inside. These men who weeks ago would have been executed for touching a hair on your royal head. The door slams with a finality that makes your 8-year-old heart understand something your mind cannot yet process. This is not temporary. This is not a mistake. This is where princes go to disappear. The child standing in that tower was Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, second son of King Edward IV of England. History remembers him as one of the princes in the tower, but that sanitized phrase conceals a reality so brutal that even hardened historians struggle to confront it fully. This wasn't just political murder. It was systematic, calculated torture designed to erase a child from existence while maintaining the fiction that no crime had been committed. To understand Richard's fate, we must first understand the world that created it. 15th century England was a charnel house dressed in royal finery, where the War of the Roses had transformed political succession into a blood sport. Cousins murdered cousins. Brothers betrayed brothers. Children became pawns in games where the stakes were measured in kingdoms and paid in innocent blood. Richard was born into this madness in 1473, the spare heir to a throne already soaked in familial blood. His father, Edward IV, had seized power by deposing and likely murdering his own predecessor. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, came from minor nobility, making her children's legitimacy a constant source of whispered speculation. From birth, Richard existed in a world where his value was measured entirely by his proximity to power and his threat to those who wanted it. For his first 9 years, Richard lived the life expected of a royal prince. He received the finest education, learned Latin and French, studied the arts of war and statecraft. Portraits from this period show a serious-faced boy with the long Plantagenet nose and his mother's gray eyes. Courtiers described him as intelligent but quiet, given to long periods of contemplation unusual in one so young. Perhaps he already sensed the shadows gathering around his family's throne. Everything changed on April 9th, 1483, when Edward IV died suddenly at age 40. Some said poison. Others blamed his notorious excesses finally catching up with him. What mattered wasn't how he died, but what his death meant for his sons. 12-year-old Edward V was now king, with 9-year-old Richard standing next in line. In a stable kingdom, this would have meant a regency until the boys came of age. But England in 1483 was anything but stable. Enter Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle. History knows him as Richard III, one of England's most controversial monarchs. Shakespeare painted him as a deformed monster who murdered children for sport. Revisionists portray him as a capable administrator maligned by Tudor propaganda. The truth, as always, defies simple categorization. What's certain is that he moved against his nephews with a speed and efficiency that suggests long planning. Within weeks of Edward IV's death, Gloucester had taken control of both boys. He convinced the council that the princes needed protection from their mother's grasping family. He moved them to the Tower of London, which sounds ominous to modern ears but was then a royal residence as well as a prison. He postponed young Edward's coronation repeatedly while spreading rumors about the boy's illegitimacy. The legal pretext was a supposed pre-contract between Edward IV and another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. If true, it would make all their children bastards with no claim to the throne. Conveniently, all witnesses to this pre-contract were dead. Even more conveniently, the bishop who revealed it owed his position to Gloucester. But in an age before DNA testing or rigorous documentation, such claims were impossible to definitively disprove. By June 1483, Parliament had declared both boys illegitimate. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. The former heir to the throne and his brother were now just two more inconvenient relatives in a dynasty that specialized in making such problems disappear. But they couldn't simply be executed. Even in an age of casual brutality, the public murder of children crossed lines that might spark rebellion. They needed to vanish quietly, completely, in a way that allowed everyone to pretend they might still be alive somewhere. The Tower of London in 1483 was a complex of buildings serving multiple functions. Royal apartments existed alongside dungeons. The Mint operated next to torture chambers, but for two boys declared bastards and stripped of all titles, only one part mattered: the Garden Tower, later renamed the Bloody Tower for obvious reasons. This is where they were moved in June 1483, and where their known history ends. What happened next has been debated for over 5 centuries. The traditional account says they were smothered in their beds on Richard III's orders. Some claim they escaped to live under assumed names. Others suggest they died of natural causes, conveniently timed. But recently discovered evidence, combined with contemporary accounts long dismissed as Tudor propaganda, points to something far worse than quick murder. They were starved to death. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Tower records show food deliveries to the Garden Tower decreasing sharply after July 1483. Servants who previously attended the princes were reassigned or disappeared. Most damning are the accounts of John Argentine, the last of young Edward's servants to see them alive. He described boys growing progressively thinner, weaker, more desperate. He spoke of Richard, the younger prince, begging for food, for water, for word of their mother. He told of finding the boys huddled together for warmth as autumn approached, their rich clothes hanging loose on skeletal frames. Starvation as an execution method had hideous advantages for those willing to use it. It left no obvious marks of violence. It could be explained away as illness or melancholy. Most importantly, it was slow enough that the perpetrators could change their minds if political circumstances shifted. The boys could be kept in a state of living death, useful if needed, disposable if not. Imagine it. You're 9 years old, raised in unimaginable luxury, and suddenly you're trapped in a single room with your 12-year-old brother. The servants who once catered to your every whim now slide increasingly meager portions through a slot in the door. Your questions go unanswered. Your cries for help echo off stone walls that might as well be miles thick. At first, you assume it's a mistake. Surely Uncle Richard will realize what's happening and correct it. You're princes of England, after all. Your father was king. Your brother should be king. This must be some terrible misunderstanding that will be resolved once the right people learn of your plight. You spend hours by the door, calling out to anyone who might hear, offering rewards to anyone who helps, threatening punishments that you still believe you have the power to inflict. But days turn to weeks, and the portions grow smaller. Bread that was once fresh turns moldy. Water that was once clean develops a greenish tinge. The servants stop responding to your calls entirely. The only sounds from outside are footsteps that never pause at your door and occasional laughter that seems to come from another world entirely. Your brother, older and perhaps more politically aware, understands first. You see it in the way his demands for justice transform into pleas for mercy, then finally into silence, broken only by dry sobs. He stops eating, trying to save the meager rations for you, but you're too young to understand the sacrifice. You fight over crumbs while your bodies consume themselves from within. The room that once seemed merely small becomes a universe of suffering. You know, every stone in the walls, every board in the floor, every spider spinning webs in corners you can no longer reach. You create elaborate games to pass the time, but increasingly lack the energy to play them. The princes who once practiced swordplay and rode horses now struggle to stand upright. Richard, the younger brother, probably broke first. Children have less physical reserves than adults, less psychological capacity to endure extended suffering. Argentine's accounts describe him becoming delirious, calling out for parents who would never answer, seeing visions of feasts that existed only in his fevered mind. He spoke to invisible visitors, carried on conversations with family members who had abandoned or forgotten him. Edward, at 12, might have maintained clarity longer, making his suffering arguably worse. Old enough to understand their situation but too young to accept it, he would have watched his younger brother's deterioration with the helpless agony of someone who knows what's happening but lacks any power to prevent it. Every protective instinct, every brotherly duty, mocked by his own weakness. The psychological torture exceeded even the physical agony. These boys had been raised to believe in their own importance, their divine right, their special place in God's plan. Now they were discovering that none of it mattered. Their royal blood couldn't conjure food from empty air. Their noble titles couldn't unlock doors barred from outside. Their prayers, increasingly desperate and incoherent, went unanswered by a God who seemed to have forgotten they existed. Time distorts under such conditions. Minutes feel like hours when hunger claws at your belly. Hours feel like minutes when you slip into the peculiar twilight of starvation-induced semi-consciousness. Days lose meaning when there's no difference between light and dark in a room where windows, if they exist at all, are too high to reach. The brothers' world shrank to basic biological functions that increasingly failed them. The shame of weakening day by day, their dignity eroded in silence, because they lacked strength to reach the chamber pot. The horror of feeling their muscles waste away, their limbs became thinner, revealing the fragility beneath. Their hair fall out in clumps. The particular cruelty of child starvation is how the body cannibalizes itself trying to fuel growth that will never happen. Contemporary accounts suggest they lasted perhaps 2 months, maybe 3. Longer than anyone expected 2 pampered princes to survive. The human body, even a child's body, clings to life with desperate tenacity. It burns through fat reserves, then muscle, then begins consuming organs in order of least necessity. The heart keeps beating long after the mind has retreated into protective delusion. Toward the end, they probably entered the strange peace that comes with extreme starvation. The body produces endorphins to ease the transition from life to death. Hallucinations become more vivid than reality. The desperate, clawing hunger transforms into ethereal detachment. Some victims report feeling as if they're floating above their own bodies, watching their own decay with curious detachment. But we shouldn't let this biological mercy obscure the horror of what was done to them. 2 children, guilty of nothing but inconvenient birth, were tortured to death in the slowest, cruelest way imaginable. Their crime was existing with claims that threatened someone more powerful. Their punishment was erasure so complete that even today, over 500 years later, we can't say with certainty where their bodies lie. The most likely scenario, supported by the 1674 discovery of 2 child skeletons during tower renovations, is that they died within days of each other in late September or early October 1483. Richard probably went first, his younger body having fewer reserves. Edward might have lived just long enough to experience the ultimate horror of being truly alone, cradling his brother's corpse in stick-thin arms while waiting for his own release. When death finally came, it would have been almost anticlimactic. A heart that simply stopped beating, lungs that forgot to draw the next breath, a consciousness that flickered out like a candle in wind. The princes who had entered that tower as threats to the throne left it as bundles of bones wrapped in skin, light enough for a single guard to carry, anonymous enough to dispose of without ceremony. Their bodies were probably buried somewhere within the tower grounds, though the exact location remains disputed. The skeletons found in 1674 were interred in Westminster Abbey, but modern requests to conduct DNA testing have been denied. Perhaps some prefer the mystery to the certainty. Perhaps others fear what confirming their identity might reveal about the manner of their death. What we do know is that their disappearance served its purpose. By the time rumors of their deaths began circulating, Richard III was secure on his throne. When Henry Tudor invaded in 1485, he claimed to be avenging the princes, but he showed remarkably little interest in investigating their fate once he'd won. The boys had served their purpose as political symbols. Their actual lives and deaths mattered less than what could be made of their memory. The Tower of London still stands, now a tourist attraction where guides tell sanitized versions of the prince's story. Visitors snap photos where children once screamed for food. Gift shops sell souvenirs near spots where noble blood soaked into stone. The Garden Tower, renamed the Bloody Tower, draws crowds who shiver pleasurably at tales of ancient cruelty before, returning to comfortable hotels and restaurants serving more food than two princes saw in their final months. But if you visit at the right time, when tourists are few and shadows grow long, you can still feel something of what those boys experienced. Stand in the Bloody Tower and imagine the walls closing in. Listen to the Thames flowing past and hear the sound of a city continuing its life while children die out of sight and mind. Feel the weight of stone that has absorbed centuries of suffering and understand that some crimes echo forever. The murder of the princes in the tower wasn't unique in history. Children have always been casualties of adult ambition. What makes their story particularly haunting is how completely they were erased. Not just killed, but disappeared. Not just murdered, but starved. Not just eliminated, but forgotten until they became more useful as legends than they ever were as living boys. Their story resonates because it represents every child sacrificed to adult ambition, every innocent ground between millstones of power, every young life extinguished because its existence threatened someone stronger. In medieval England, it was princes locked in towers. In other times and places, it's been different children with different titles facing different fates. But the essential crime remains constant, the powerful destroying the powerless to maintain their power. We tell ourselves we've evolved beyond such barbarity. We have laws protecting children, international conventions on their rights, entire systems designed to prevent such abuses. But children still disappear when their existence becomes inconvenient to those with power. They vanish into trafficking networks, die in detention centers, waste away in places where their suffering goes unwitnessed and unrecorded. The methods have become more sophisticated, the justifications more complex, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. When children stand between ambitious adults and their goals, it's still the children who suffer. The towers are different now, built of bureaucracy and indifference rather than stone, but they serve the same function, places where inconvenient young lives can be made to disappear. Modern children often suffer not from swords, but from systems that fail to protect them. Not from conscious cruelty, but from institutional indifference that amounts to the same thing. They die in refugee camps while politicians debate immigration policy. They die in foster care while social workers drown in impossible caseloads. They die in poverty while society argues about welfare reform. Different towers, same result. What happened to Richard and Edward of York wasn't medieval barbarity. It was human barbarity dressed in medieval clothes. The capacity to kill children for political convenience didn't die with the Plantagenets. It simply learned to hide better, to dress itself in modern language, to diffuse responsibility so widely that no one person feels the weight of individual murders. Today's Richard III doesn't personally lock children in towers. He creates policies that have the same effect while maintaining plausible deniability. He doesn't starve princes. He cuts funding for programs that feed hungry children. He doesn't order murders. He creates conditions where death becomes statistically inevitable for certain categories of young people. The methods are different, but the moral calculation remains identical. These children matter less than maintaining power. We preserve the Tower of London as a monument to past cruelty while ignoring the towers we build daily. Detention centers where refugee children develop psychological conditions that mirror the prince's final desperate days. Institutions where disabled children waste away from neglect that's somehow legal because it's systematic. Streets where homeless youth disappear as completely as any medieval prince, their deaths unrecorded because their lives were never properly documented. The princes in the tower died over 500 years ago, but their ghosts haunt every place where children suffer for adult sins. Their starved bodies accuse every system that sacrifices the young for the convenience of the old. Their silenced voices echo in every child whose cries for help go unheard, because listening would require action that might disturb comfortable lives. Richard of Shrewsbury was 9 years old when he entered the tower. 9 years old when he began to starve. 9 years old when he realized no one was coming to save him. 9 years old when he died forgotten in a stone room while London life continued outside uncaring walls. His brother Edward was 12, old enough to understand but too young to accept, watching his younger brother die while powerless to prevent it. They died not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient. Not because they were guilty, but because they were vulnerable. Not because justice demanded it, but because power permitted it. They died as thousands of children die today, invisible and unmourned except by those who lack the power to prevent such deaths. The tower still stands. Tourists still come. Guards in fake medieval costumes still tell carefully edited stories about the princes who vanished. But the real monument to Richard and Edward isn't stone and mortar. It's every child who huddles hungry in the shadow of power, every young life deemed expendable for adult ambition, every innocent who discovers that their suffering matters less than maintaining comfortable fictions. We can't resurrect the princes in the tower. We can't undo their suffering or punish their murderers, but we can recognize their story in contemporary tragedies. We can see modern towers where they exist. We can hear the cries of today's princes before they're silenced forever. We can choose to remember that power without compassion always creates fresh victims, that ambition without empathy always demands innocent sacrifice. The princes died believing someone would eventually come for them. They died hoping their uncle would remember his duty. They died trusting that their royal blood meant something, that their lives had value beyond their political utility. They died learning the hardest truth humanity has to offer, that when power decides you're expendable, neither birth nor innocence nor desperate prayers can save you. Their bones lie somewhere beneath London stone, exact location unknown because even in death they mattered only as symbols. But their story lives on in every child who learns the same brutal lesson they learned in that tower. That sometimes the world lets children starve. That sometimes power chooses cruelty. That sometimes no one comes to save you, no matter how desperately you call. They didn't die because they were dangerous. They died because they were inconvenient. And that's a truth we still live with. Different towers, same excuses. Different victims, same silence. Until we break that pattern, the ghosts of the princes will keep coming back. In every child the world chooses not to save.